Dr. Wisdom, Senior Energy Consultant and Analyst, joins us virtually this morning. Thanks so much, Doctor, for sparing some of your hours, your early morning hours with us. And let's quickly get your take from this visit. I understand issues of oil exploitation has been a concern within the Niger Delta region. Some said we must also pay attention to resolving the communal clashes, the problems within the community, and all of that. As some said, the communities are demanding for compensations, equitable, also making them feel sense of belonging. How would you rate the effort of the president towards this matter?
Thanks very much. I think it's very comprehensive in nature, looking at making sure that in the first instance there is a sense of inclusion from the community. I think that's really important because look at the whole Petroleum Industry Act. What it's come to do is to recognize the fact that you need to create a host community build provisions to create that engendering environment for community collaboration as part of the oil and gas exploration. And if the communities feel disenfranchised in some form, shape, or manner, then they will not take ownership of the installations, and they will not take ownership of the entire project itself. So what the president is doing, on one hand, we are growing our portfolios by ensuring that we are now optimizing our production. We are also looking at exploring new frontiers. We're also looking at sanctioning new projects. For example, the Bonga North $5 billion project. But the president recognizes that all of these will not yield anything if there is no intentionality in bringing the host communities involved, and so has moved proactively to say, look, how do we get a lasting solution, or perhaps build a long-lasting and implementable template that we can then apply all over where we have community issues? And that's very important, because I think that is one area that we're lacking. If the communities take ownership, then we wouldn't have the persistent issue of oil theft, which is at some point has been responsible for a decline of over 30% of Nigeria's oil production.
Good morning. We appreciate you joining us. But let's get right to it. By the late 1950s, it was already established scientifically and otherwise that there was a large deposit of crude, black gold, like they call it, in this country. It's been several decades down the line. We're still discussing some of the issues experts like yourself will say are elementary. Ogoni cleanup, for example, has been here for a while. I understand we won a case off the shores of Nigeria in that regard. While we still have former President Muhammadu Buhari in office, we're talking about some 20 billion naira cleanup fund for Ogoni land. How is it that we are still cycling around these issues in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, you're absolutely spot on. We did not take this as a very important action item for all this while, and I'm going to even, just to, buttress my point, I'm going to bring something to bear. Up until the enactment of the Petroleum Industry Act, there wasn't a very clear provision on even plug and abandonment, which simply talks about how you intend to return the facility to its original condition when you have finished taking out the resources. And why is that important? Because it has become a recurring issue where we find that international oil and gas companies are about to divest in their investments, but there is the question of who is to put the funds available for the eventual cleanup of these assets, because a lot of those assets, for example, are getting older, and in other climes, the older assets at some point need to be plugged and abandoned, and they usually save money from day one. And the reason is this: as you go on in the life of a facility, the actual potential of that facility declines over time. So it is not at the end of that decline where your operating cost is now almost eroding your profit margins that you begin to put out money for plug and abandonment, which is really expensive. So just in a nutshell, we have been thinking about all of these not in a very proactive manner, in a very reactive manner. And it has come to a point where a lot of it is biting us because we haven't actually put that concerted effort towards ensuring that those environmental concerns are being addressed. It is a bit later in the day that we have now looked at that and then trying to address it. So we're playing catch up. And so what I'm trying to explain is because of the last, the kind of relaxed manner that we've approached the entire environmental concern, that is why we've had it linger for over 60 years. And up until recently was when we had the laws that would be able to back us in terms of putting all the imperatives that are required to ensure that the environment are cleaned up both during the operations and at the end of the facility life.
It's Niger Delta as a whole. We understand the role entirely of the Niger Delta in getting some of these things, where the state will also have the discovery and some spots of oil as well. Because now the conversation might not just be towards Ogoni. I mean, can we just also extend it? Because I've also seen some communities in the Niger Delta having some agitations, still even starting with the miscreants to also, be stealing our oil and also covering them in the communities and all of those concerns. Now that we have the PIA and all of those, proper documentation and description of that what it ought to address, how can this be implemented? Because implementation is the issue right there. Why we clearly, been signed in 2021 and this is 2025. We haven't also feel the impact and swift responses in terms of implementation. What is your call and what is your concern?
Right. The first call and concern I have is, let's go to the host community bill, for example. The host community bill, I have a big concern in the way it was well intended, but the way it was designed and how it has affected the outcomes. First and foremost, the host community bill was written in a way that the companies would be the one to select the people on the host community trust fund that would be the representative of the community. Now, underline the word, the company that who, of course, have their own interest that is perhaps very different from that of the community are the ones selecting representatives of the communities in the trust fund. And so you found out that with that, how many trust funds are actually being funded and how many project executions are going on as a result of this? This is part of the question. So we've had 2021 till date and we haven't had much traction in that direction. That's a real concern, just like you've highlighted. So what do I think from an implementation standpoint? I think we need to just ask ourselves, are we ready to do this or not? The second thing is, we shouldn't just leave this by chance and say, well, we're going to be banking on the ethics of the companies that are going to operate this, for example, the trust fund. There should be some sort of oversight with punitive actions from, some regulator. Someone should be looking at it, taking stock, reporting it to the public to let them know who are stewarding some of those, host community inclusion goals and who is not. Because until we do that, what typically happens is that we enact the laws, we don't have a way to implement it properly, and then people just go on doing exactly what they're doing till today. You can't go to most areas and say this project was sanctioned as a result of the host community funds. So why is this important? Because it's all bits and pieces of a body language or a signature that is indicative of how much we care about the host community. It's not just about the cleanup. It's not about the environmental degradation. We've recognized the lacuna, as the lawyers would say it, and we have commenced a way to be able to address some of these concerns. However, how well have we designed a pathway to it? What is the monitoring and the reporting mechanisms to ensure that people are doing what they ought to be doing? And also, most importantly, how are we structuring funding in place to sustainably implement some of these projects that will achieve two purposes? Purpose number one is to make sure that those degradations are addressed, however slowly, but of course progressively. That's the first one. The second issue that we have to address is because of the opportunity costs. Right? For all of these years, there has been a lot of oil exploration activities, and the host communities have somehow found out that they've lost out in opportunity cost. If there's a degradation, for example, in Ogoni land, the fishing and the aquatic life would be affected. So the whole aim of the host community, fund provisions is meant to restore some of these losses and make sure that where there was an opportunity cost to the communities, that they regain it. Where we were hoping that there would be fishery and some sort of agricultural activities that may lead to funding for maybe a hospital project for the community, that the fund would make available some of these assets, facilities, infrastructure to engender development. And so those are the two core areas we ought to be doing, but there needs to be somebody who is going to be looking over the shoulders of the oil companies and telling them, no, you're not doing this, and then of course reporting that consensuously to the public.
So we can't have this conversation without some continual reference to the PIA as a very pivotal factor or piece of legislation in this regard. We have seen the PIA bring a bit of, some bunch of reforms into the sector. But let's talk about some of the issues, some of the concerns with the PIA. Yes, for every piece of legislation in the world, anywhere in the world, you can always go back and do a review, remove a few items, introduce a few new items, and what have you. But look, let's talk about how that. Some persons have said not much has changed at the community level between when there was no PIA and now that the PIA is in force.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like I said, it's the lack of enforcement. And the truth of the matter is, for every time that we have a law or policy direction and it's completely ignored, we set a new precedence, which is where I get very worried. The PIA, of course, has, let's explain how it works. We have a PIA that brings some broad reforms in terms of the direction of reform, but those PIAs, that PIA rather, has to be implemented or operationalized using regulations. So it's not that the law itself should have every single bit of instructive nature. This is how it should be done. This is who should do this. It is the regulators that would then sit down and write regulations that would then become the vehicle that will convey the intentionality of the PIA. And this is what is lacking. So you're absolutely right when there's a concern that we are not implementing. And this is the issue. A lot of time we have fantastic intents, right, on our legal framework, but when it comes to implementing it, then we're found wanting, and we're asking ourselves, did we really understand it, or did we just pay experts to write very clever words and put together very good intent, but we clearly do not understand how we're going to be able to implement it much successfully. The PIA is, of course, we understood what has why the PIA had to be done, and it has had very good successes. Just like I'd like to point out, clearing the whole issue about who is a regulator and who is the operator when it comes to NMPCL is very clear right now. The PIA has also come in to bring some frameworks for developing the oil sector, for which the president has also done a build on that to say the presidential directive on oil and gas reforms. The oil and when we now go to the room for more improvement, I would like to say is the host community bill. There's clearly something that needs to be done. So what can we do? We can have the regulators themselves go back and look at the host community bill. I'm not entirely sure whose prerogative is going to be, but they need to sit down and look at how do we make this to be operationalized, how do we set the penalties that are going to drive this, and how do we even measure it in the first instance. You're clearly absolutely right, it's lacking, and perhaps if we think about in terms of the energy that has to be put in, maybe the federal government is prioritizing first at that point trying to get more production. So the upstream regulators were really working hard with regulations to create that effect. And then we now have to go to the downstream quickly to make sure we're self-sufficient. And I think that they're tackling those items in a kind of a list a format. So they've gone down to the host community, realizing that if no matter what you do, if the host communities are not included, then there will be a sabotage. And so I think that's what they're doing at the moment. And we only hope that they take on board some of these, ideas that we've posited to make sure that when they put out regulations to operationalize this, that it comes out with the desired effects.
For Michael Johnson, I was going to ask you, we talk about these issues most times, and it's as if we're running the circles. Let's talk about the international oil companies for a second. When you look at these developments as nasty and as worrisome as they are we holding IOCs accountable enough?
Yeah, we are, but the KPIs are very different. So in a country, right, let's put it this way, in a country where we are mostly struggling, right, we're trying to just have the basic funding to meet our needs and all of that, you find out that the key performance indicators are skewed more towards how much money are they bringing? Do they pay their taxes? How can we make them happy so they don't get up and leave? It's also very difficult a conversation, especially when you're thinking in line of the fact that a lot of these IOCs are saying the more you require from us from an environmental standpoint, the more it adds to our cost of oil production. Because if you think about it, let's put a scenario in place where an IOC is not, of course, having to take care of the environment or put any of those funds towards the environmental, care. That would reduce how much they have to spend versus when they have to do it. So when they're already telling you, the cost of doing business is already high in Nigeria, if we do this, it will become unprofitable, we may think to divest, then that is when we begin to, sort of reduce our KPIs on the environmental side, but up our KPIs on the production side of things. But you're absolutely right that I think we've come to a point where we need to balance both, because at the end of the day, if we do not take care of the environment, then we would have all theft issues that will also mean there are losses that needs to be accommodated within the entire operational margins of the IOCs, which will inadvertently increase the cost of their production. So it's a very interwoven situation that we need to delicately handle. And it is very important that accountability is not. Accountability has nothing to do with just enforcement. Accountability, as I've explained, has to do with profitability if you look at it from the grand scheme of things.
Just a follow-up to your last comment, because those that said it looks like there's also issues of political resource control and all of those concerns. But in a way of accountability, we have the federal government, the state, and the local government, and it's always looking at the fact that some are leaving just this fight, for the federal government. Federal government, through their wisdom, have to set up a Niger Delta Development Commission to pay attention to all of those aspects that have been raised by the host communities in the way of addressing the problems of the Niger Deltas. But what are the states also doing on their end, to protect just common resources of the people? Because there was a recent approval by the last administration giving out some of the Niger Delta states some derivations, funds and allocations after some time. But in a way, the state and the local government are not totally. We've not also seen effort for them to also protect, the common good of the state, the common good of the nation as well. What is your call in respect to leadership? Because there must be a political will and actions to also be taken towards this direction.
All right, so I think it is very important to understand that the call for leadership and the right form of leadership is something that we cannot overstate. However, right, let me put it this way. There's a difference, and I'm going to highlight in impact if we do things in two different ways. Let's take, for example, you have a special commission that is responsible for doing projects, and their objective function is to make sure that the welfare of the host communities are taken care of very well. That would have much of an impact in the host communities than if you said to a state governor, take some of these funds. You know why? the state governor is looking at the broad expansion of the economic prospects of his states, and not just the welfare of the particular host community that is being affected, or perhaps that brought the oil. So that's the difference. And so, of course, money has been released to the governors, and they now have the prerogative to think, okay, these are the projects I want to run with this money, right? That's going to be a slightly different effect. So ultimately, it's going to be a balance of both, right? Sometimes maybe giving the money, there'll be specific projects that have been sanctioned, as well as giving that money to say, okay, whatever remains, you can use it for the broader development goals that you have. But until you can have specific projects, you wouldn't have the desired impact, because the governor could be given money, which is perhaps maybe thoughts that he'll put it in, for example, in developing those areas, and then he may choose to put that money in developing other sectors completely in a different environment for which he feels that is more profitable. So you see, a lot of those funds are put out there for social, on a social basis, to say, okay, go develop this area that has been marginalized, or that there's been environmental degradation as well as a result of the activities and exploration and production activities. But the governor may be thinking profitability and put that money completely in a different direction that would not touch it. So Edikan is a bit, Michael, is a bit of both that I think we need to be able to handle. Accountability is core, but also the direction of that accountability is also very important.
Look, when we talk about issues around oil exploration, production, and all of the monies that come from it, it's always an elitist conversation we are having. However, we are told that crude and whatever derivatives we get from it are part of the Commonwealth for Nigerians, as well as in particular for those in this region where crude is being exploited. How do we make the profit that comes from crude exploration trickle down to the least person in the community, especially when you see the scale of pollution? I mean, there are waters, the entire environment, schools are not, healthcare is not accessible in most of these communities, and of course education is more like a hard nut to crack in this area. So how do we open up the space, bring in fairness and equity in such a way that it becomes a win-win for everyone?
Yes, okay. I think one of the thoughts that I have in my mind is, when we're designing policies, we have to look at creating what I call the primary, secondary, tertiary linkages. And these are very important, because if you think about what you can do just by yourself, for example, maybe a governor, what he can do with that money, you will not be able to touch all the communities. And sometimes there may be, even when you have money in the coffers of the state, you may find out that there are communities that are worse off even than the oil producing communities. And sometimes you might also want to create a kind of a decentralization effect from an economic standpoint, to make sure that you develop other areas so that people can now move from the central area to the other areas, and so you decongest the effects on one area, the economic pressure on one area. That's one thing that the governors tend to do. But if you have an idea of creating linkages, you know that there's a central economy from oil, but you also know that you can bring investors in, give them the necessary hands for them to create the primary linkage. Primary linkage from oil upstream is, for example, a refinery. And from there, you also do a secondary linkage, for example, which could be from that refinery, could be petrochemicals that are being taken and produced from there. Primary linkage, again, could be gas industries, could also be fertilizer plants and all of that. And then the tertiary industries could be things like the hospitals that have to serve them. But until you have a strategic roadmap and a plan, and then stitch them all together, you cannot create that effect. Because why? When you are able to create that effect, coupled with the fact that you're also expanding other development frontiers across your various geographical regions in your state, then already those entities will begin to do corporate social responsibility. That's a way to reach the guys at the grassroots. So we need to look at governance. The whole objective of governance as government is not really to run some of these private entities and then be able to put some of those initiatives all the way to the grassroots. What has to happen is the government would do some bets, right? But their major job is to create the enabling environment for businesses to thrive in a very interconnected way that will engender progress and also bring some of those effects trickle down to the people at the grassroots, and in a very systematic way that is very sustainable. So I think anyone thinking about governance needs to think what I can do, but more so to help the grassroots, how I can stimulate the economy that will create a ripple effect from the central economy all the way down to the person at the end. And I say this for a reason. I have lived in clients. For example, I lived in Bath in UK. I never knew the mayor of Bath. I never got anything to do with the government bursary, but because there was a systematic economy that was created, there were companies that were creating several outreach programs that I benefited from all the way to the grassroots where I lived, but I did not need to know anyone in government. So it's a mix of both, but it takes someone that clearly has a vision and understand how to stitch all of those, as I said, linkages together.
Just before we let you go, I mean, just out of context, but still within the same jurisdiction, Dangote says they are not responsible for the recent increase in the prices. I've also attributed to issues of global crude oil price. And that takes us to asking you of your concern about how other non-oil sector can strengthen, our own currency, because we can't really have Port Harcourt refinery, as said, over 60% in operation, and one refinery that has also come to port, also Dangote refinery, local refinery as well, and they are still increased. Nigerians are worried there ought to have been reduction in the price we had as last month at over 965, some 980, but right now the price is increasing again, and Nigerians are worried. What would be the contribution of other non-oil sector in getting this thing resolved?
I think the non-oil sectors that we're talking about, one of the benefits that we'll get is when we are able to create the right quality and the right quantity for exports. I think that's very important. For example, agriculture. One of the things that is holding us back in agriculture has to do with processing and storage. Those are the two key things that we need to do. And even being able to grow some of those crops that we have strategic advantage. We have in palm oil. We have, also in yam, for example, so we can take advantage of this and grow and export it. But are we able to create the value chain that would, kind of catalyze those export-oriented activities and get us to where we can earn money from export? That's one thing that we need to think about. The other thing is this, right? And this is to kind of sound my disappointment with the way the budget outlook is for the solid mineral sector. You cannot say you want to start creating a value-driven solid mineral sector and then remove the rent seekers, and you're only putting a paltry 9 billion naira funding towards that sector. No, it's more like we're saying one thing while we're doing another thing. One of the ways we can do, because that solid mineral sector, go to Ghana, is exactly what Ghana did before the advent of oil, and they sustained the economy on decades on that. So it has a very rich context. If we cannot get that funding required to get those minerals from there, what we ought to be doing is to run concession plans that we can then bring people in, get them to develop, get them to sell all of some of those, and then we can do a profit split, or they can pay their royalties and taxes. But what is unacceptable is to have a very huge sector like the mineral sector, solid mineral sector, that we are not tapping because we don't want to put funding, and we have not found very ingenious ways to be able to harness the value. Those two sectors are areas that we can add significant amount, grow our GDP by over 20%, and definitely sectors that we need to start thinking about very smart ways around them.
Expert and consultant, for spending some part of your morning with us today. We do hope you have a great day ahead of you.
Thank you very much. Do enjoy your day.
We'll take a quick break, everyone. We'll return shortly and the rest of the program continues. Do stay with us.